In this course, you will learn about JavaScript DOM manipulation. This is where you use JavaScript to modify, change, or delete elements of a website. In the first part of this course, you will learn the basic features of a website DOM and the JavaScript commands you can use to manipulate the DOM. In the second part of the course, you will use what you have learned to create practical examples from beginner to advanced. This course was created by CodeLab.
So just before we begin, we're just going to take a look at a few prerequisites. So this two-part tutorial is primarily for beginners. So if you've never heard about the DOM, or maybe you're a little familiar with it but don't know how to utilize and apply it, this tutorial is for you. Now, in order to effectively understand the DOM and how it relates to working with the web, it's necessary to have an existing knowledge of HTML and CSS, and I have crash courses on both of those if you want to check this out before you start this tutorial. It's also super beneficial to have a familiarity with fundamental JavaScript, so the syntax and the code structure. If you guys want to learn about fundamentals of JavaScript, check out my JavaScript crash course, which covers the fundamentals. So there's a couple of things you'll need if you want to follow along this tutorial. You're going to need a web browser and a code editor. Now, these are all the options you can use, and you can mix up these options if you like. But in this tutorial, I'm just going to be using Chrome and Visual Studio Code. Again, you guys can choose any combination you like. Now, the structure of this tutorial, we're first going to take a look at what the DOM is. Then we're going to take a look at methods to select elements in the DOM, how we can traverse the DOM, how we can manipulate the DOM, and then finally we're going to take a look at event handling. So we'll start this off by explaining what the DOM is. So the DOM stands for Document Object Model. Now, the document object is a built-in object that has many properties and methods that we can use to manipulate the content, the structure, and the style of a project. And this ability to manipulate the DOM, or the document object model, is one of the most unique and useful abilities in JavaScript. So almost any time a website performs an action, such as toggling a navigation menu, or rotating between slideshow of images, or even displaying an error, when a user attempts to submit an incomplete form, this is the result of JavaScript accessing and manipulating the DOM. Now, another way of thinking about the DOM and understanding how it works is thinking of it as a tree of nodes, like you can see it on the screen now. So this is just a basic diagram of a DOM tree and all of its nodes. Now, everything in this diagram is a type of node. The elements, the attributes, the text content, and even line breaks and comments, which we'll see a bit later on, are even considered nodes, and all of these make up the DOM tree. Now, the DOM object itself is actually a property of the window object, which is the global top-level object representing a tab in the browser. And this window object has access to such information as toolbars, the height and width of the window, prompts, and even alerts. But in this tutorial, we're only interested in the document object, which is what is inside of the inner window and the stuff we want to manipulate. Now, another important thing to note here is that most of these nodes in this diagram have a parent-child-sibling relationship. The topmost node, i.e. the document node here, is the root node of the DOM tree, which we use to access the DOM and manipulate all of the content. Now, this document node has one child node, which is the HTML element, and the HTML element is a parent node to the head and the body elements. Now, the head and body elements are what you would call siblings, since they're on the same level in the DOM tree. Underneath the head element, you see it has one child node, which is the title element, and the text, "This is my website," is a child node of the title element, and these relationships are similar over the other side, where the body element is the parent to the paragraph and the H1. The paragraph and the H1 are siblings to each other, and the text content inside each of these elements are child nodes to the paragraph and H1. So the my link and my header are child nodes to the H1 and the paragraph element. Now, we can also see by the paragraph tag we have a class attribute. Now, HTML attributes such as IDs, or classes in this case, styles, etc. are also considered as nodes in the DOM hierarchy, but they don't actually participate in this parent-child-sibling relationship like the other nodes do. The way they are accessed is through properties of the element node that they're contained in. Now, often there will be times you want to move throughout the DOM, so understanding this parent-child-sibling relationship is crucial to understanding how JavaScript works with HTML. Alright guys, so now we know a little bit more about what the DOM is and learn about the DOM tree. The next thing to cover in the tutorial is how to select these nodes or elements in the DOM tree for manipulation. So before we take a look at all these methods of selecting elements, let's just quickly go over the layout you see here in the browser. So in the index.html file, we've got a div with a class of container. Inside of that, we've got a heading which has the ID of main heading and then the text of favorite movie franchise. Underneath that, we have a UL tag which has 5 list items inside of it, and then each of these list items have a class of list items. So super creative. Now, this is what we're going to be working on when we're looking at selecting, styling, traversing, and manipulating for the rest of this tutorial. And then underneath that, we have a script tag which has the attribute of source, and this is just linked to the app.js file. So again guys, in order to be able to manipulate an element in the DOM tree, we first have to select that particular element. Now luckily for us, there's several ways we can do this, and the 5 major ways of selecting the elements are the ones you see on the screen now. So we've got get element by ID, get element by class name, tag name, query selector, and query selector all. Now some of these methods are pretty self-explanatory, but we're going to go over each of them one by one now. So the first one we're going to go over is get element by ID, and as you probably guess, you can select an element using this method by its unique ID. And this is the easiest way to find a HTML element inside the DOM tree, because as we know from CSS, the ID attribute is used for something unique. Now if we remember back to the HTML file, you can see that we've got the H1 here, which you see in the browser, has the ID of main heading. So this is the element we're going to be selecting. So first we need to select the document object model, which is just simply document. Then get the method of get element by ID, single quote marks. Really important that you include those, and then we're just going to grab the ID, which is main heading. Close that off. Now what we can do with this selection is actually place it inside a variable so we can manipulate it. So we're going to go at the front here and just say const, and say title, and we'll set this to the ID of main heading. And if we log this into the console now, so we'll just log in title, you see it shows up on the console now, and if I hover over this, you can see it highlights in the browser there. So you know now we've selected this element. And then what we can do from here is now select that variable we just created for the element, and we can add styles to the element, manipulate its attributes, traverse the element, so all of that good stuff, which we'll be looking at in just a moment. Now next we have the get element by class name. Again, quite self-explanatory. This method returns a collection of all the elements in the document with that specified class name. So for example, in our HTML file here, you can see all of our list items have that really creative class name of list items. So we can select all of these using the get element by class name method. So we'll do the same thing, we'll put it inside a variable, we'll just say list item, and we'll set it to the document, we'll say get element by class name, put single quote marks in there, and then we'll just say list items. I think it's items, yeah, it's items, and then we'll just log this in the console so we know we've selected that element or these elements. And as you can see, using the method of get elements by class name, we've now selected all of those elements. Now this method actually returns an array-like object of all the child elements which have all the given class names. So if we open this up, you can see it's indexed and they're in the order that they are in the HTML file. Now the next method here, which is get element by tag name, is pretty similar to the get element by class name, in that it accepts a tag name and returns all of the elements of that specified tag name in the order in which they appear in the document. So again, returning an array-like object for all the child elements with the given tag name. So for this example, all I'm going to do is just copy and paste the class name example, comment this out, and then we'll just say tag name. And because the list items are list items, we just type in li. And if we take a look at the console now, you can see it's got that HTML collection of all the 5 list items, and they're all indexed in the order that they appear in the HTML file. So you can see this method is pretty similar to the get element by class name method. Now the query selector method that you see here is used to select one item or the first item that matches the selector it's given. So if you have multiple items with the same class name or the same ID or even the same tag, it will select the first one it comes across. So the beauty of this method, as you probably just guessed, is that it can accept all CSS style selectors, again allowing it to select it by its tag or its class or even its ID. So we can actually use this method to actually grab any element in our HTML file here. So what I'm going to do is use it to grab the div of the class of container, which is acting as a container for the rest of the content. So we'll just go underneath here and we'll create a variable and we'll keep it super creative and call it container, and we'll grab the document and then grab the query selector method. And again, with this method we can grab the div tag, or we can grab the class name, or if it had an ID attribute we can grab that instead. What I'm going to do is grab the div tag and then just log this into the console so we know it's working. And as you can see in the console now, using the query selector method, we've selected that div with the class of container. Now, as I just mentioned, when we're using the query selector, it selects the first item that matches the selector it's given, which in this case is the div. Now, if we go into the index.html file and we use several more divs, again, it's only going to select this first div here. If we had more divs in this example and we wanted to select them all, we'd then use the query selector all instead. So what I'm going to do actually is just duplicate this one more time. Just zoom out a little bit, and then just going to change a bit of the word in here. So favorite sports, and I'm not going to bother changing the names here, but just to show you guys that it selects all of them, I'm just going to copy and paste this, but instead of query selector, we're going to say query selector all, and then comment this out, and quickly just comment all these out so we can only see that variable there. And if you take a look at the console now, you can see that this method returns a node list of collections of all the matching elements that matches that specific CSS selector, which in this case is a div. So similar to the get by tag name and get by class name, where we get a HTML collection, in this method we get a node list, and as you can see, it selected both of the containers, because unlike the query selector, with query selector all, it's selecting all of the divs in the index.html file. So that's how we can select elements with the query selector and the query selector all method. So to quickly summarize this section, when you need to select a DOM element, you have 5 different options to choose from, 5 different ways of essentially doing the same thing, which is selecting an element or elements. Personally, I primarily use query selector and query selector all because these methods select elements through CSS selection, and I primarily use this to select IDs and classes, mainly because these CSS selectors provide a really powerful and efficient way of selecting HTML documents, especially IDs, because you likely understand that elements shouldn't have the same ID, that the ID is a unique identifier of that element within the document. So with that in mind, selecting an element with its ID is a safe bet, because you wouldn't go and apply manipulation to different elements unless perhaps that's what you want to achieve. In that case, the query select all method and the class selector is what I typically use. So now we know all the different methods that we can use to select an element in the DOM tree. We can finally start doing some manipulating now. So firstly, what we'll do is just get rid of all of this content here, and then head in the index.html file and just get rid of the second container because we don't really need it. So let's start things off by taking a look at how we can change the styling of an element. So if you are familiar with CSS and CSS properties, we have a way we can access these properties in JavaScript. So the first thing we'll do is just select this main heading, which we have in our index.html file here, which is just the title of the container. So we're going to put that in a variable, and we'll call this variable title, and then document.querySelector method, and we'll grab the ID of this element, which is main heading. Oh, need to put these in single quote marks, and then let's just log this in the console so we know this variable is working. And as you can see, now we've selected this element and stored it inside the variable of title. So what we can do now is actually manipulate the styling of this element and change it around using CSS properties. So to access CSS properties in JavaScript, we'll just first grab the variable we want to apply the styling to, which in this case is the title or the main heading, and then we simply type in the style property. And then after this style property, you just use any CSS property you want to apply to this element. So what we'll do is just change the color of the text, and we'll set this to let's say red. And as you can see in the browser now, we've changed the color of the main heading from white to red using the style property and then the CSS property of color. Now this type of styling is what you'd call inline styling, and there are other methods to style elements with JavaScript, but this is probably the most direct method. Now again, if you take a look in the console, you could see it's actually included the style attribute, again because this is actually done through inline styling. Now it's important to know this because with inline styling, this actually only works on a single element. If I tried, let's say, applying it to all of the list items here, this wouldn't actually work. So just going to demonstrate that to you guys. So let's create another variable, and we'll call it list items, and we'll grab all of those list items with query selector all. They all have a class of list items. And then let's just log in here list items. So you see now in the console we've selected all of those list items. Now let's try and use the style property again on these list items and see if it works. So we'll say style, let's try and change the color again, or let's actually do the font size. And just quickly guys, I wanted to mention that it's important to remember while using the style property, CSS properties are written in camel case and not with a more standard snake case which has the dash. So the camel case is essentially just a capital letter to begin the second word and any subsequent word in the name or method or even a property. font size in CSS would be written like this, but in JavaScript we'll use camel case. So just so you guys are aware of that. Now again, back to what we were talking about. If I try changing all of the font size of these list items here, so let's say to about 2 rem, you can see this isn't actually working because it's trying to apply an inline style to 5 different list items, which wouldn't work. If we actually wanted to apply this styling to all of the list items, we need to loop through the list items first. So just to show you guys how that would work, we'll say I equals 0, and then we'll say I is less than the list items dot length, which just gives us the amount of list items inside of our UL here, which is 5, and then we want to say we want this to increment by 1 each time. And then what we do now is just apply this and put it inside of our for loop, and then we just need to index the I. And as you can see now, it was quite subtle, so let's just make it a bit bigger. You can see all of the list items now have that styling because it's been looped through using the for loop. So that's how we can apply inline styling to elements using the style property, or multiple elements if we loop through them. And the next thing I want to take a look at is creating elements. So what I'm going to do is just comment all of this out first. Get rid of the list items there. I'm just going to put a comment here for styling elements. And then now we'll do one for creating elements. So again, another really cool thing about DOM manipulation is that we can create elements from our JavaScript file here, and we do that with a simple method really of create element. So let's say we wanted to add another list item here in our favorite movie franchise container. What we need to do first is just create a variable for the unordered list, because we need to enter this unordered list. So we'll say document dot query selector, grab the UL, and then what we'll do now is use the create elements method to create another list item. So we'll just use another variable here, so document dot create element, and we'll create a list item. Now this isn't actually going to do anything at the moment. This element we've just created in this variable here needs to be inserted into our document, and the way we can add elements inside of the document is using the append method. So what we'll do is first grab the UL, because we want to append this list item inside of this UL, and then we grab the append method and the element we want to append, which is the variable of li, which again is just this list item. Now you won't be able to see it currently at the moment, but if we take a look at the document here, and if we open this up and then open up the div of the class of container, open up the UL, you can see there's an extra list item inside of this UL now, because we've inserted this element now using the append method. Now what we can do from here is add some content inside of our list item. So I'm just going to bring this back down, go back in the console. I'm just going to put a comment here for adding elements. And then after this, we're just going to say modifying the text. Now we don't really need this console log anymore. So there are several ways we can include text or modify text in our HTML, and those ways are inner text, text content, and inner HTML. Now there is a difference between the three, so to demonstrate those differences, I'm just going to put another HTML tag inside of the first list item here. So I'm just going to put a span, I'm going to put neo, because that's relevant to the matrix, and then I'm just going to create another variable to grab that element there. So we're going to say first list item, set that to the document, and we'll say query selector, and then we'll grab that list item, and then I'm just going to grab the console log again actually and put in here first list item. Oh, forgot an S. So there's our first list item. Now what I'm going to do here is include inner text first. So it just displays the text. Duplicate this a couple more times, and I'm going to grab text content, and then also grab inner HTML. So if I just pull this up a bit more now. If you take a look at the console, you can clearly see the differences between the three now, and that is essentially just the way they're displayed. So with inner text here, you can see we're simply getting the visible text contained inside that node. With text content, you see it's actually being displayed the same way it is in the HTML file. So it's got all those indents, and it's jumping onto a new line. And with inner HTML, a similar sort of thing with the indents and jumping on new lines, but it's also showing the tags, so showing us the span tags inside of our HTML here. So again, that's pretty much the differences between the three. Now another thing here is that with inner HTML, there is a bit of a danger using inner HTML, and that's mainly its security issues. You don't really want user input to be displayed in the inner HTML, because this actually allows the user to control the JavaScript and the HTML on your web page, which obviously has its problems there. So in most cases, you're just going to use inner text. So let's go ahead and use that and implement that in our list item that we created. So we're just going to grab the li, grab inner text, and we're going to set this to equal, let's say, X-Men, which is another franchise. If you take a look at the browser now, you can see that text has been included inside of our list item now. Alright guys, so we've created our list item here, we've added it into the UL using the append method, and we've also given it some text. The next thing I want to do now is make our list item look like the rest of the list items. So to do that, we're going to need to learn how to modify and manipulate an element's attributes or classes. Luckily for us, JavaScript provides several methods and properties for adding, removing, or changing a HTML element's attributes or classes. So we're going to go underneath here and just put a comment of modifying attributes and classes. And the first method we're going to take a look at is the set attribute method. So we'll grab our list item and we'll say set attribute. And as you probably guessed, because it's pretty self-explanatory, what it does is set an attribute to our specified element, which in this case is our list item. So for this attribute, you need to include two values. The first is the attribute you want to set, which we'll just put an ID. And then the second is the name you want to give that attribute. So we'll just give this attribute, let's give it the ID of main heading. And as you can see in the browser now, because we've given this list item the same ID as our main heading here, which is main heading, you can see it's got the exact same styling. So as you can see, the set attribute method is quite powerful. Now the next method I want to take a look at is how we can actually remove this attribute. So we'll go underneath here and we'll say li.remove attribute. Again, pretty self-explanatory. So let's say we want to remove the ID from our list item there. All we put in here is just ID. Close that off. And you can see now it's reverted back to its default styling and doesn't have that styling that the main heading does. Now there's also a way we can access attributes in JavaScript, so which follows a similar sort of method. So we'll say, let's say we want to get the attribute of our main heading here. What we need to do is first let's just create a variable for it. So const, and we'll say title equals document dot query selector. And then grab the main heading, and then let's just log this in the console. So we'll say title.get attribute that we want is the ID, and as you can see in the console now, it's given us main heading, which is the ID associated with our main heading here. So that's how we can deal with attributes here. Let's take a look at how we can deal with classes. So I'll just get rid of all of this, and we'll grab our list item again, and then we'll use the property of class list. Now this class list property has quite a few methods we can utilize, and the first one we'll take a look at is how we can use the add method, which of course will just add a class to our list item. So we'll say dot add. So let's say list items, and as you can see, when we add that class now, our last list item here is the exact same styling as the other list items, because again we've added the same class as the rest of the list items. Now what we can also do here is remove this. So we'll say remove, and again it will just revert back to its default styling, because of course we've removed that class now. Now another thing we can find out is whether an element has that specific class. So I'm just going to log list item into the console here, class list, and we'll use the method of contains. And we're going to find out if it contains list items, and as you can see, it's returning us false, because of course we removed that class now up here, so it's giving us false. If we change this method to add instead, you see now it's returning us true, because of course our list item here now does contain this class here. So that's how we can modify attributes and classes in the DOM. Of course, the DOM has many more methods than this, but these are just some of the core methods you'll likely need to use. Now, there is still one method left to use, and that's how we can remove an element. And the method to remove an element, or our list item in this case, is a pretty simple method to remember. I'll just put in here first, remove elements. So all we need is the remove method. So we'll say li.remove. And if you take a look at the console now, you can see that the list item has been removed. And if we just open up all of the elements, and we'll open up the div here and open up our UL, you can see that list item is no longer there. So we've learned quite a bit about the DOM now. We've learned how to access elements in the DOM. We've also learned how to create, add, modify, style, and remove elements in the DOM too. The next thing I want to take a look at is how we can navigate the DOM. So I'm just going to bring you guys back to the slide which we looked at the beginning of this video, where we have a really basic diagram of a DOM tree and all of its nodes. Now, everything in this diagram that you see here is a type of node, so that includes the elements, the attributes, the text content, and even line breaks and comments inside the HTML document are considered nodes, and all of these together make up the DOM tree. Now, the DOM object itself is actually a property of the window object, which is the global top-level object representing the tab in the browser. The window object has access to so much information, such as the toolbar, the height, the width of the window, even things like prompts and alerts. But in this tutorial, we're only interested in the document object, which is what is inside of the inner window and the stuff that we want to manipulate. Now, if you also remember back to the beginning of this tutorial, most of these nodes in this diagram have a parent-child-sibling relationship. The topmost node, i.e. the document node, is the root node of the DOM tree, which we use to access the DOM and manipulate all the content. Now, this document node here has one child node, the HTML element. The HTML element is a parent node to the head and the body elements. Now, the head and body elements are what you would call siblings, since they're at the same level in the DOM tree. Underneath the head element, you see it has a child node, which is the title element, and the text, "This is my website," is a child node of the title element. And these relationships are similar over on the other side here, where the body element is parent to the paragraph and the H1. The paragraph and the H1 are siblings, and the text content inside of each of these elements are child nodes. So the my link and the my header are child nodes to the H1 and the paragraph element. As you can see here, we also have a class attribute, and HTML attributes such as IDs, styles, classes, etc. are also considered as nodes in the DOM hierarchy, but they don't actually participate in the parent-child relationship like other nodes do. They're accessed as properties of the element node that contains them, so they would be a property of the paragraph tag, for example, in this diagram. Now, often there will be times where you want to move through the DOM without specifying each and every element or node beforehand. So learning how to traverse the DOM tree is essential to understanding how to work with JavaScript and HTML. So let's head back into VS Code now and look at the different ways we can traverse the DOM. Alright guys, so it's pretty drilled in now that we're aware that the DOM is full of different types of nodes which have parent-child-sibling relationships. And if we just head into the HTML file here just to see this in action, you can see that the HTML element is the parent of the head and body element, and the body element is the parent to the div, but not the H1 here or the UL, since these are two levels down from the body. Now the H1 and the UL are what you would call siblings because they're on the same level. So what we're going to do here is use this UL and traverse upwards in the DOM and find out what the parent of the UL is and also the grandparent. So we'll head back into the app.js file and go underneath parent node traversal, and let's just first create a variable to grab that UL. So we'll say let UL equals document dot query selector, and then grab the UL and then just log this in the console. So we've got our UL there, and you can see it hovers over it. And as we know, nodes in the DOM are referred to as parents, children, or siblings, depend on the relationship to other nodes. Now the parent of any node is a node that is one level above it or closer to the document in the DOM hierarchy. So to find out the parent node here, we have two options. So the first option is parent node. Duplicate this, and we also have parent element. And as you can see in the console now, we're getting the div with the class of container because this is the parent of the UL here. Now say we wanted to actually traverse upwards again and find out the grandparent of the UL, all we need to do is double down by chaining the properties together. So after parent node, we just write parent node again, and we'll do the same thing with parent element. And as you can see now in the console, we're getting the output of body because two levels up from the UL here, first is a container and then the body. So as you can see, what we've done here is managed to traverse up the DOM tree from the UL to figure out what the grandparent is. So it's really useful to know these kind of properties. Now you may be wondering what the difference is between these two, and it will make more sense when we take a look at how we can traverse child nodes in just a moment. But basically the clue is in the name. So you can see here we have parent element and parent node, and we know that elements are a type of node, and this is where it can confuse people, because as we know, nodes can be text, they can be a document, comments, or even line breaks. So this distinction can help grasp the difference between the two. Now that might still confuse you guys a little bit, so I'm just going to show you this in action. So I'm going to comment all these out, and I'm just going to create a variable for our HTML element. So we're going to set this to document element, and then I'll just log this in the console again. So we'll log in here HTML, and you can see we've selected our HTML there. Now I'm going to do the same thing and apply the parent node and the parent element property to this HTML variable. Say parent node, duplicate this, and we'll say parent element. And as you can see, when we take a look at the console now, the parent element is returning us null. That's because the job of the parent element property here is to try and retrieve the parent element of the HTML element, i.e. the document node. However, the document node and an element node aren't the same type of node, hence why we're getting this null here. So the parent node property will try and retrieve any node, regardless that type of node. So generally, parent node is more commonly used when we're traversing the DOM. But again, even if you use parent element, you likely won't run into this problem. So that's how we can navigate upwards in the DOM. Let's now take a look at how we can traverse downwards in the DOM by taking a look at the child node traversals in the DOM tree. So for this example, we're still going to stick with the UL, and we're going to traverse downwards into the list items. So I'm just going to comment this out and then go underneath the comment. And because we're sticking with the UL here, I'm just going to put this here so we can see it. And I'm just going to console log in UL. Now, just like the property of parent node and parent element, we also have child node properties and child element properties, which pretty much work in the exact same way. So let's first take a look at the child nodes property and see what it gives us. So after the UL, I'm just going to type in here child nodes. You can see in the console now it's given us a node list, and if I open this up, we get a list of every child node inside of the UL. Now again, this is where the distinction between nodes and elements becomes more evident, because you might have expected this property here to give us the 5 list items, but in addition to the 5 list items, 6 text nodes. This is because we actually wrote out our own HTML. This wasn't generated by JavaScript, and inside of the HTML here, the indentation between element nodes is counted in the DOM tree as text nodes. So just to show you guys what happens if I remove one of those indentations, so I'm just going to put this list item in the same line as the 4th one. You can see now in the node list it's saying 10 instead of 11, again because indentations are counted as text nodes. So again, that distinction between nodes and element nodes becomes even more evident. So what I'm going to do is actually just put that in another line again. So we get a node list of 11. Now, as well as this child nodes property here, we also have first and last child. And as you probably guessed, this just selects the first and last child node of our list here. So I'm just going to duplicate this a few more times. And for this example, we need to write is just first child and last child. And again, this is just returning us text nodes, because if we take a look at the node list here, you can see that the first index is a text node, and then the last index is also a text node. Now, when we're using first child and last child here, which is selecting the first and last node, we need to be very mindful if we try styling an element using this property. So just to show you guys what I mean, if I grab the UL here and I say first child, and we're going to style first child, we'll say background color, and we'll set it to let's say blue. You can see we're getting an error now because the first child here is actually a text node. It's not an element. Now, to select the node we want to apply this styling to, what we can do instead of using first child here is grab the child nodes property and then take a look at the node list. And I think we wanted to apply the styling to this item, which is indexed at 1. So we grab our square brackets, grab the first index number, and if you take a look at the browser now, you can see that our first list item here has the background color of blue, which we applied here in this styling. Now again, like the parent element here, we also have the same thing for the children elements, which is only going to select the element nodes. So what we'll do is just comment all these out, and we'll use that UL again, and we'll log in, let's log in UL and then grab children. Now instead of a node list, you can see it's returning us a HTML collection, and it says it's 5, which is these 5 list items inside of our UL. Now again, like first child and last child, we can do the exact same thing for the first child elements. So we'll say first child element. So that's how we can traverse downwards into the DOM using child node properties. So lastly, now we're just going to take a sibling node traversal. So again, nodes that are siblings are nodes that are on the same tree level in the DOM. So if we take a look at our HTML again, we know that the H1 and the UL are siblings to each other because they're all on the same level. Now it's also important to note here that siblings don't have to be the same type of node like they are here as element nodes. If I put a text comment between the two of these, so I'm just going to put in here space between. This too would classify as a sibling to the H1 and the UL because they're all on the same level. So let's put that in a visual perspective for you guys. So I'll go back into the app.js file and I'll go underneath this comment here. And I'm just going to grab our UL again and comment these out. And just log this into the console here. So we get our UL again. Now, just like the two previous traversal properties, we have properties for nodes, which covers all the nodes, and we also have properties which just cover element nodes. So let's first take a look at how to select all types of nodes. So after the UL here, we've got the previous sibling, and if I duplicate this, we've also got the next sibling. And you can see in the console now we're getting 2 text nodes, and just to show you why we're getting 2 text nodes, I'm just going to create another variable for our div. We'll just call this div. We'll grab the div, and we want to find out all of the child nodes inside of that div. Oh, spelled div wrong. You can see we'll open this up now, and as you can see, when we've used these 2 properties here, we've got the UL. Before the UL is a text node, and after the UL is also a text node. So that's how these 2 properties here are working. Now again, like the other properties we used beforehand with parent element and all of these child element nodes, we have the exact same thing for sibling node traversal. So again, if you just wanted to find out the sibling element nodes, instead of using previous sibling and next sibling, we can use the previous element sibling, and we can also use next element sibling. And I'm just going to comment out this. And if you take a look at the console now, you see we're getting the H1 because this is the previous element sibling node beforehand in the HTML, as you can see here. And then for the next element sibling, we're getting a null because there's no element nodes after the UL. Right guys, so we've gone through quite a bit of information now regarding the DOM. We've looked at what the DOM is, we've looked at how we can add elements to the DOM, style elements in the DOM, remove and modify elements in the DOM, and we've just learned how we can traverse the DOM. The last topic I want to cover in this tutorial is taking a look at event listeners. Now, event listeners are among the most frequently used JavaScript structures in web design, and what they do is basically just allow us to add interactive functionality to HTML elements by listening to different events that take place on the page, such as when a user presses a key, or when elements load, or when a user clicks a button. Now, the most common events you might listen out for are load events, touch start events, key down events, mouse over events, and of course click events. Now we'll take a look at some of these in just a moment, and I will leave a link in the description if you guys want to check out all the other DOM events. But let's learn about the 2 most common ways we can add event listeners in our projects. Now the first way we can include an event is actually inside of our index.html and directly inside one of these elements. So what this event is the global onEvent attribute, and this way of creating an event to an element works pretty much like any attribute. We insert it directly into the HTML element that's present on the page, or the element we want to apply the event to, and then apply a one-liner script to that particular element, which in this case is going to be this button here for our first example. So we'll go inside the opening tag here like we do with any other sort of attribute, and then we include whichever event we'd like to happen. For this example, we're going to use an onClick event, so we'll say onClick. Now what I want to fire off when we click on this button is just to show us an alert box that has the content of I love JavaScript. So we'll put in here alert, and then we'll put the content of I love JavaScript, and that's all we need to write for this attribute. So the syntax for this, as you can see, is pretty simple. We've included the onClick event attribute, so when we click on this specific button in the browser now, the event will fire off and then the alert function will be executed, which will have the text of I love JavaScript inside of it. So we'll head into the browser now, and I'm going to click on this button here. And as you can see, when I click on the button, the alert box pops up and it's got the content of I love JavaScript, which we wrote inside of this attribute here. So that's the first way we could include an event in our projects, which is just direct into the HTML on the element we want to apply the event to. So pretty simple and probably the most direct method of including an event listener inside of our projects. Now the next method to create an event listener is the JavaScript add event listener method. So to create that, we'll head back inside our app.js file, and the way this method works is first include a element that we want to apply the event listener to. So we'll just put in here element, and then we use the add event listener method, and then inside of here we include the type of event. In this example, we'll use another click event, and then after this, the second parameter is the function we want to fire off, and then we also have an option here for a third parameter, which will take in a Boolean data type, so true or false, and this is in relation to bubbling and capturing, which we will speak about in a moment, but we're not going to include that at the moment because by default it's already false, so it's not too important yet. So we'll just close that off. So that's essentially the syntax of adding an event listener using the add event listener method. So for this example, we're going to use the example 2 button here, and again we're going to create another alert box. So the first thing we want to do is create a variable for us to reference from. So we'll call it button 2, and the button 2 in the HTML here you can see has a class of btn, so we're going to retrieve that. So document dot query selector, and then grab the btn2, and then first we want to create a callback function. So the function, we'll call this alert btn, and inside of here we'll just put another alert box and then type in here I also love JavaScript. And then what we need to do now is include our event listener. So we're just going to copy the syntax, paste it in here. The element is that button 2, so we've got our add event listener method there, and then the function is going to be that alert btn, and we've got a little, and it's saying, oh, we've got the e in listener. So what we've done now is included a click event on the button 2, which is this button here. So when we click on this, this alert box should fire off and should appear at the top of the screen with the content again of I also love JavaScript. So let's test this out. And as you can see now, this event is working and we're getting our alert box which has the content of I also love JavaScript. So that's how we can use the add event listener method here. So let's take a look at another example, for example 3. So instead of a click event, we'll look at a mouse over event. So we'll say mouse over here. So for this example, instead of clicking on a button here, when I move the mouse over, I want the background of this whole box to change. So to do that, let's first grab, I think it's box 3. So we'll create a variable for it. And we'll call this variable new background color. Grab the box, so document.query selector, and it's box 3, and then we'll first create the function. So we'll say function change bg color. So we'll grab that variable now, new background color, style dot background color, and let's set it to the color of blue, and then we'll now include that mouse over event. So we'll grab the variable add event listener method, and we'll say mouse over, and then the function, which is change bg color. So if I head over to example 3, if I now move the mouse over the box here, it should change its background color to blue. And as you can see, that's working as it should. We managed to change the style of our third box using the mouse over event and the event listener method. Now generally people do tend to use the add event listener method more than the HTML on event method, typically because you can apply as many event listeners to an element through the add event listener method, whereas with the HTML on event method you can only apply it once. So if you had one event already on a HTML element and then you try to apply another one, that new one would override the old one. But again, if you only want to apply one event, the on-event method works perfectly fine. So these were some really basic example, guys, of how we can implement event listeners. We'll now take things a little step further by creating a reveal hide event where we click a button to display some text which is originally hidden. Alright guys, so the really cool thing about event listeners is that we can combine them with CSS and other JavaScript tools to create interactive and fun constructs, which for this part of the tutorial is our simple example here where we have a button, and then when I click on this button you can see it reveals more text, and if I click on the button again it hides the text. Now the HTML for this example is really simple. So we've got a div here with a class of container. Inside of that div we've got a button element which has the class of reveal BTN and a class of boxes which is just a general class. Underneath that we have a div with a class of hidden content which has all of our dummy text inside of it. This also has a class of boxes, and this is what it currently looks like right now in our live server. Now the first thing I want to do here is go in our app.js file and create two constants. So we grab those two elements. So the first one is going to be for our button. We'll just call this reveal BTN, and then we'll say document dot query selector, and we'll grab that element which has a class of reveal BTN, and then we want to create another constant for our hidden section. So we'll call this let's call this hidden content, and then document dot query selector, and then grab the class of hidden content, which I think, yeah. So we've got our two constants there. The next thing I want to do now is create a callback function which will check if our hidden content here has the class of reveal BTN. Now I will explain this in more depth, but for now let's just create that function. So we're going to create that function. We'll call this function reveal content, and then inside the curly braces here we want to use an if-else statement. So we'll use the if statement first. Inside of the brackets is our condition, so we'll say if our hidden content, grab the class list property, contains class of reveal BTN. So there's our condition. The code that we want to execute if this condition is true, grab the hidden content, grab the class list property, and we want to actually remove this class if it does contain the class. So we want to remove the class of reveal BTN. Again, this will make more sense in just a moment, but we're just going to write this out for now. Else, if it doesn't contain that class of reveal BTN, then we want to grab the hidden content, class list property, then we want to add that class of reveal BTN. Now the next thing we want to do now is include our event listener. So we want to apply the event listener on our button here. So we'll say reveal BTN, add event listener, and we want to look out for a click event. And then the function we want to run off is the reveal content function we just created. And the last thing we're going to do now is visually hide our div here which has the dummy text. So we'll do that inside our style sheet. So we'll go inside the internal style sheet here, grab the class of hidden content, and we'll say display none. And then when the function runs off and it does include our class of reveal BTN, we want to grab the hidden content, grab the reveal BTN class, and then we want to display as block. So this now should be working. So if I click on our button, you can see it reveals our paragraph. I click on the button again, it hides the content. So what we're essentially saying here is that depending on the current state of our hidden content here, JavaScript will either add or remove the reveal BTN class. So in its current state right now, this button here does not have the class of reveal BTN, and hence why it's not displaying, because we've set this here to none. When we do click on this button, it will display as block because we've added our event listener here, which looks out for a click. It will run through this function. It will check here if it does contain the reveal BTN, which it doesn't. So if it doesn't, we've got our else statement here, which will add that class of reveal BTN. And because we've set it as block here, it will now display it. If we click on the button, and as you can see, it's displaying it now. And if we click on this button again, it will run through our function here, and it will first check if it contains the class of reveal BTN, which it does currently in this state. So it will remove that class of BTN, and because in our internal style sheet here we've set the display to none, it will effectively hide our content and just show us the button here. So if I just show you guys what that looks like, if I just comment out the remove section, if I click on the button, it will display it because currently right now it's added the class of reveal BTN. But if I click on this now, you can see now it's still displaying the text because in our if statement here we no longer have the ability to remove that class. So that's how we can create a really basic reveal hide functionality using event listeners, which looks pretty simple, but this technique actually can be used for many different things. So for instance, you can use it for things like toggling a menu on small screens, so when you see that hamburger menu, or you can display error messages with this, and many more things you can do. So guys, that's how we can create events in JavaScript, how we can fire off different types of events. And again, there are loads of different types of events we can create, and I'll leave a link in the description for you guys if you guys want to check those out. Now this is actually just scratching at the surface of event listeners. There are some things lurking underneath, or more appropriately put, lurking behind the scenes of event listeners, and that is event propagation and event delegation. Let's first take a look at what event propagation is and what it means. Now event propagation refers to how an event travels through the document object model, or the DOM tree, and you can think of event propagation as electricity running through a wire until it reaches its destination. Now as we're fully aware, the DOM is full of nodes, and when we're referring to event propagation and events, the event needs to pass through every node on the DOM until it reaches the end, or it's forcibly stopped. Now event propagation is also the umbrella term which is used to cover three phases when dealing with event listeners. You first got the event capturing, then you've got the target, and then you've got the event bubbling. Now in the simplest definition, the capturing phase starts from the root and travels all the way to the target. After it's reached the target, it goes into the bubbling phase, which travels back up from the target to the root. So to better understand this, let's take a look at a visual representation of the event propagation. So in this slide you can see we have a basic diagram of our three phases. Now imagine that our button at the bottom here has a click event attached to it and is being clicked. Now when this happens, JavaScript behind the scenes starts the three phases. First it begins with the capture phase, where it starts at the highest level of the DOM and it will trickle all the way down and will notify each element. So it will notify the HTML element, the body and the div, and tell it that something underneath it is being clicked. So again, going back to that analogy of electricity running through a wire. So this will trickle until it reaches the target phase. This phase is the DOM node in which we click. So in our example, the button here at the bottom has a click event attached to it. So this would be the target and essentially our target phase. So once this target phase is triggered, the next phase is what we'd call the bubbling phase, which is essentially just the opposite of the capture phase. This travels back up the DOM and notifies every element, so the div, the body, the HTML, the document, all the way up to the highest level parent of the target. Again, this is all happening behind the scenes and is almost instantaneous. So let's go ahead into VS Code now and take a look at what this looks like in the browser and the console. Alright guys, so we're inside VS Code here, and you can see in our example here, we have several elements nested inside of each other. If you take a look at the HTML, the markup is pretty simple for this. So we've got our div which has a class of div2. Inside of that we've got another div with a class of div1, and then inside of that div we have a button element. So this is what it looks like in the browser, and as you can see it just has some basic styling. Now if we head into the JavaScript here, you can see we have event listeners on pretty much everything in the DOM tree. So we've got one for the window, we've got one for the document, we've got one for the div2, div1, and then the button here. Now as you can see, I've set this up a little bit differently in regards to the event listeners. Instead of creating a variable for the window, the document, as well as the elements here, I've just added the event listeners directly after. Now creating a variable and doing it this way both work perfectly fine, but for this example there's less code here and it just saves me scrolling up and down a bunch of times, which can be a pain for people. Now in regards to the events themselves, you can see they're click events, and as for the functions, they just simply log in their respective name in the DOM tree, except for the button here. Now instead of the text, you can see we've included an E inside of the function's parameters, as well as the inside of the function we're logging in that E. Now I will explain what this is in just a moment, but first I just want to draw your attention to the third parameter inside of all these event listeners. So if I highlight them all for you now, you can see they all have a Boolean value of true. Now, if you guys remember back to a bit earlier in the video when we were learning about the add event listener method, there was a third optional parameter we could include. Well, this third parameter dictates whether we want to use event capture or event bubbling. So let's go ahead and click on the button here in the browser and see what this gives us in the console. So as you can see now in the console, it's given us the first phase, which is the capture phase. So it's starting from the window and then it's going down and notifying all the other elements it comes across, all the way down to the target, which is saying is this pointer event. Now the stuff that you see here represents all of the information about that event. So this is exactly what that E means inside of our function here, which is inside of our button. So this E represents the event object, and again this is exactly what you see here in the console. All this information is about that event that has occurred on this button. So if I open this up, you can see all the different properties and information about our event here. So we've got all sorts of things we can take a look at and utilize. So we can find out what type it is. We know it's a click event. We can check out where exactly that button is exactly on the screen in a browser, on the X and Y axes. We can also check things like whether the shift key here has been pushed down, saying false because we didn't use the shift key. So all sorts of things that we can use here and utilize. Now the main property I want to bring your attention to, and the relevant one to the three phases, is the target property here. So this here you can see is saying the button. So this property represents the element that the event is actually on. So again, it relates to our target phase. So if I actually go into our console here and I type in here .target, and I'll just refresh this and I click on the button again, you can see now it's starting from the window, going to the document, div2, div1, because we're using the target property to show us what element the event is on, which again is our button. Now again, we can do some other cool things here. So let's just say, for example, when we click on this button, we'll just change the text to say clicked. So after the target, we say .inner text and set this to, let's equal it to, say, clicked. So what should happen now if I click on the button? It should change the text to clicked. So as you can see now in the console, when we've clicked the button, it's changing the text to clicked, because what we've done is use the event object to grab the target, which is the button, and then from there we use the inner text property and then changed it to clicked. So when this function fires off, the button's text changed to clicked. So as you can see here in the browser, and if you also take a look at the console, you can see we also see phase 1, so the capturing phase. So we start the window, document, div2, div1, and then click, which is the button. So that's the first and second phase. How do we now initiate the third phase, which is the bubbling phase? Well, to do that, all we need to do is just grab all of the true values here for our third parameter and just change them to false. Now these are actually false by default, and if I click on the button now, you can see it's starting from the button and then it's going to div1, div2, document, and then the window. So it's bubbling upwards, hence the term event bubbling. So from the target, it's bubbling up to the highest position in the DOM tree. Now there are ways we can actually stop event propagation. So let's just say we wanted to stop the bubbling to happen at the second div. We can do that with the stop propagation method. So let's go to the second div here, include our event object. Then inside of here, we'll just say e.stop propagation. So what should happen now is when I click on this button, once it reaches the second div, we want the propagation to stop. So we'll no longer be able to see the events on the document and the window. So if I click on this, you can see it's going from click to div1, div2, because we've stopped the propagation in our function here. Now this also applies to event capturing. So if I grab all of the third parameters here and change them to true, so we're in the capture phase, and then I click on this button, you can see the opposite's happening, because we're starting from the window where the capture phase begins, then goes to the document, and then goes to div2, and then stops at div2 because we've stopped the propagation. So that's how we can stop event propagation happening for capturing and bubbling. Another useful ability we can utilize in event bubbling is to have events fire off only once. So for this example, again, we'll use div2, and I'm just going to comment out the stop propagation method there, take out the E, and then change all of these to false, even though they're false by default. We'll just keep it like this for consistency. So again, if we only want div2 to fire off once, for our third parameter here, what we can do is grab the once property and set this to true. Now if I click on this button, you can see it fires it all off as normal, so it starts from the click and bubbles up all the way to the window. If I now click this button again, you can see it's starting from the button or the target, going to div1, but now div2 is no longer firing, and then it goes onto the document and then the window. And then again, if I click this again, you can see the div2 event isn't firing off, because again, what we've done here is define that we only want this event to fire off once. Now another common method you likely run into is the prevent default method. Now what this method does is pretty self-explanatory really. It just prevents any default behavior that might occur on an element or on an event. So this is quite dependent on the type of element involved and the context of an event. So to see an example of the prevent default method, what I'm going to do is go into the index.html, and I'm just going to change the button to an anchor tag, and I'm going to give this a class of button, and I'm just going to put in here click, and then we'll go where the styling is for the button, and we'll make this a class. And then what we'll also do is just put it on a new line, so we'll say display block, because anchor tags are inline by default. So we'll head into the app.js file, and what I'll also do is just make sure our query selector here is targeting that class of button. So our anchor tag now in this event listener here is now the target and the event. And because we've changed the button to an anchor tag, if I click on this now, you can see it's firing off all the events, but they quickly refresh. And the reason it's doing this is because the default behavior of an anchor tag is to try and redirect us to somewhere else. And this is what's causing this quick fire off of all the events and then a refresh. Now we can stop this from happening with the prevent default method. So to do that, we'll go inside our button here, or the class of button, and we'll grab the event object, prevent default. And if I click on the button now, you can see it's showing us the bubbling phase. The content has changed to clicked and it's staying there. And all this has happened now is because we apply the prevent default method onto our anchor tag, so it's no longer trying to direct us to somewhere else. Now we will see a more practical example of all the methods we just learned, so the prevent default, the stop propagation, in part 2 of the tutorial where we look at practical examples and projects. But I just wanted to make you guys aware of these so they don't confuse you in that subsequent video. Now the last thing I want to mention in this tutorial, guys, is event delegation. Now event delegation is one of the most potent event handling patterns inside JavaScript and the DOM. And what it does is allows users to append a single event listener to a parent element that adds it to all of its present and future descendants that match that selector. Now what I'm going to do is actually break this definition down to show you guys exactly what it means. Now the first part here where it says it allows users to append a single event listener to a parent element that adds it to all of its present children. To find out why this is useful, let's actually just go back a few steps and see how we get to event delegation. So if we head back into the index.html file, you can see we've got an unordered list which has a bunch of different sports inside of it. Now this unordered list has an ID of sports, and then each of these list items have their own ID, which is equivalent to the content that you see inside of each of the list items. And this is what it looks like in the console. Now, if I click on one of these list items, you can see it's showing us in the console that football's clicked, and it also changes its background to a light grey, again to highlight that it's been clicked. And again, this is going to be the same for each individual list item. Now to achieve this, what we can do is apply event listeners to each individual list item that we have inside our unordered list. So we'll head into the app.js file and we'll grab the first list item. So we'll say document.query selector, grab the ID of football, add the event listener, and we're going to look out for a click event, grab a function. Inside of the function we'll include the event object, and then inside of this function what we want to do is first just console log in let's say football is clicked, and then the next thing I want to do is change that background color when we click on the actual list item. So to do that, we're going to first need to create a constant. So we're going to say call this target, and this is just going to equal e.target, which is that list item. And then we're going to say if, and the condition we're going to put in here is if target matches. So matches is just a method basically which essentially checks if the target, which in this case is the list item, matches with our CSS selector, which is going to be li. This is going to return true, and then when it returns true it's going to change our background color. So after the condition, we want to include the code that we want to execute. So we're going to say target dot style dot background color, and we'll set that to light gray. And if we head into this folder's live server here, you can see we have the exact same layout. And what should happen now if I click on the football list item? The background should change to a color of light grey, and it should also show here in the console. So if I click on this, you can see it's saying football is clicked, and then it's changing the background to light grey because we've just created an event listener for it inside the app.js file. Now again, if we wanted to do it for all of these, what I'd need to do is just duplicate this 4 more times. So instead of football here, we have basketball. And then for the third one we have boxing. For the fourth one we have tennis, and then we'll create one more for golf. And now all the styling and the console logs should be working for each of the list items. So we'll start with football, see that's working, basketball's working, boxing's working, tennis, and golf are also working. So we're getting the exact same thing as our draft example here, except the text is a little bit different, but again, it's the exact same styling, and you can see it's working perfectly fine. Now this is great and works fine. There's no real issue with the code here because we're getting the exact same result as our draft example. But as you'll learn throughout your coding journey, there are always questions to ask when you have written out your code to help improve it. So you can ask yourself things like, can we remove some of this code? Can we remove some of the event listeners and still achieve the same result? Can this task be done writing less code instead? Or can we even optimize this code? And the simple answer really is that we can. We can write less code here and achieve exactly the same result using event delegation. So the idea of event delegation is pretty simple. Instead of attaching the event listeners directly to each of the list items here, we can delegate the listening to the parent, which is the UL here, which has the ID of sports, so that when the LI is clicked, the listener of the parent element catches the bubbling event and then performs our task, which changed the color of our background to light gray when we clicked on one of the boxes, and also showcased some text inside of our console here. So what we're going to do to achieve this now is go back into the app.js file and get rid of all this code here. And then we're first going to grab that unordered list element, which has the ID of sports. So we'll say document.querySelector, and then we'll say we'll grab the ID, which is sports, and add the event listener to this. So a similar process. It's going to be a click event. Include our function, which has the event object inside its parameters. Inside of our function here, we want to say let's console log that bit of text. So we'll say e.target.get attribute, the method of get attribute, and we want to get the ID, and then we want to say plus we'll put in here is clicked. So what we're saying here is that when the target, which is our list items, has an ID attribute, which all of them do, whichever one that we click on will display that specific sport, plus the extra bit of text here of is clicked. So if I go ahead and click on one of these now, you can see it's saying football is clicked. If I click on tennis, you see tennis is clicked, golf, boxing, and basketball. So you can see all of these now are working, because we've attached that one event listener to the parent element, which catches the bubbling event and then performs our task, which we've written in here. Now we also want to change the background color when we click on these. So to do that, first going to need to create a variable of the target. So we're going to say target is going to equal e.target, which is those list items. And then we're going to say if the target variable there matches our CSS selector, which is our li, we're going to want to change the background. So say target.style.background color to a light gray. So again, if I click on one of these now, we're getting an error. That's because I spelt matches wrong. So again, if I click on one of these now, you can see the text will appear in the console highlighting which one I clicked, and then we also now have that extra feature of where the background changes to a light grey for all of our list items there. Now again, this brings us back to our first part of our definition, which allows users to append a single event listener to our parent element that adds it to all of its present children. And as you can see, this has clear benefits ranging from code quality as well as code maintenance, because instead of having all those lines of code in the previous example where we attached an event listener to each of the list items, we now have it all inside one event listener here. Now we've also improved our performance, because having more events in our code will take up a lot of memory, and using event delegation we're going to save a ton on memory, which again will vastly improve our performance inside of our projects. Now another crucial benefit of event delegation is the second part of our definition here. So the first part was it allows users to append a single event listener to a parent element that adds it to all of its present descendants. Now the second part of this definition was that it also adds it to future descendants that match that selector. So this is actually in regard to dynamic elements. So let's just say we had an add button here at the end of this box where it allowed us to add another sport to our list. So let's actually just manually do this to show you guys exactly what I mean. So first we're just going to create a constant for our UL, which has the ID of sports. So we'll say const, so sports equals document.querySelector and then we'll just grab the ID of sports again, which is that UL. And then what we'll also do is create another list item. So we'll say const new sport equals document dot create element, and we'll create another list item. And then what we'll do is we'll say new sport, so that variable, which is that new list item. We'll give it inner text of let's make the sport rugby, and then we'll also give it the ID of rugby. So we'll say set attribute first an ID attribute, and then we're going to have the ID of rugby. And then what we want to do is append this now to our list. So we'll grab the sports variable, which is the UL, and we'll say append child, and then the child we want to append is of course that new sport. So we'll say new sport. So as you can see now, rugby has been added to our list here. So if I click on this, it's got the exact same styling and the output in the console like the rest of the list items would, because we now have an event listener to the parent, which is the UL, and because of event delegation, we've delegated the event to the parent. And as you can see, this gives us the power to dynamically add new list items, and those new list items will display the same behavior. So again, without the magic of event delegation, we'd have to use the method we previously used, where we'd have to include event listeners to each individual list items, and that includes any new list items that might get added on along the way, which will just clog up memory, affect performance, and just create too much unnecessary code. So that's going to be it for this video, guys. In this video, we're going to be using everything we learned in part 1 and applying it to 5 different projects, ranging from beginner to master level. So just like in part 1, guys, there's going to be a few prerequisites. In order to effectively understand the DOM and how it relates to these projects, I highly recommend checking out part 1 first, as well as also having an existing knowledge of HTML and CSS. Now, in regards to styling, we're not going to be focusing too much on it for our projects because this isn't really the goal of the course. However, there will be substantial CSS styling involved. And then lastly, it's going to be essential to have familiarity with the fundamentals of JavaScript and the syntax and the code structure, because obviously we're going to be using JavaScript in this course. Alright guys, so our first project for this course is going to be this beginner-friendly quote generator that houses a quote and then has a reference by someone famous underneath it. Now underneath that reference of that famous person, we have a button which says new quote, and if I click on this, you'll see it'll just generate us some new quotes by someone else famous. So a pretty cool design and quite simple to create. Now some of the key concepts we're going to need for this project is document.querySelector, add event listener of course, the math object, and inner text property. So now we know what we're creating and the key concept we're going to need. Let's head into VS Code now and create our quote generator. Alright, so we're inside VS Code and you can see we're inside a folder called Master DOM Manipulation Part 2, inside of a index.html file, as well as having a style.css file and a JavaScript file for our project 1, and also have an image folder which has all of our images, which is just going to be the background image for all of our projects. So the first thing we want to do is include a link to our style sheet. So we'll go inside here and we'll grab style.css. Now the next thing we'll do is go and get a Google font. So we'll head over to Google, and the global font we're going to be using for our project is going to be a Roboto Regular 400. So we'll just grab the link here inside Google Fonts, head back into VS Code, and then just paste it underneath the style sheet there, and then just tab this over so it is looking all neat. And what we'll do as well is just put a comment here, so global font links, and we'll do the same for the style sheet. And then lastly, what we'll include in the head tag is just a link to Font Awesome, so we can grab all of our icons that we're going to be using throughout the project. So we're heading to our Font Awesome CDN here, and then we click the first link, so we copy the link tag, head back into VS Code, and then just paste it under our Google Fonts. So we'll just say Font Awesome link, paste that in there, close that off, and then let's open this up with Live Server. So we have our blank canvas and we can see all of our work, and we'll split screen this and just get a bit smaller. So we're ready to start a markup for our first project. So if we take a look at the original example, you can see we have two sections here. So we have our heading, and then we also have the main section which houses the quote, the famous person and the button. So we'll head inside the body. We'll just put a comment here for project 1, say quote generator, and we're going to house this project inside a div with a class of container. Hit tab, and then again we're going to need a header, so we'll just put another div here with a class of header. We'll put in here a h2, and we'll say JavaScript quote generator. So you'll see that there in live server, and then underneath the header we're going to have this content here, which houses the quote as well as the name of that specific person who said the quote, and then the button underneath, which will generate a new quote for us. So we'll head back into this blank canvas there. We'll go underneath the header, and we'll just create a div with the class of main content, which again is just going to house everything. Scroll down a little bit, and then the first thing we're going to need is the actual text area. So we can just put a div, call it text area. Inside of that we want to have a span which has the class of quote, which is going to be our quote, and then I'm going to paste our quote inside of here, which is the exact same as the original example. And then underneath the text area div we want to have a div for the actual famous person who said the quote. Let's keep it simple and just say person, hit tab, and then this person for this quote is Abraham Lincoln. So we have our quote now, as well as having the person who said the quote. And then of course underneath this we're going to have the button. So we'll house the button inside of a div with a class of button area, and this is going to house our button. So this button is going to have an ID of, say, new quote, so we're going to need to grab onto this later, and we'll just put in here the text of new quote. So that's essentially it for our markup. Let's head into the style sheet now and just apply some general styles first. So we'll just put in here general styles. So we'll use the asterisk to grab everything, and we're going to say margin 0, padding 0, box size into border box. Let's also make sure that the font family for all of our projects is our Lato font. We'll just have sans serif as a backup. And then let's first grab the body element, because we want to use display flex to center everything. So we'll say justify content to the center, align items to the center. Let's use the height and make it not 1000, 100 viewport heights, which would be the whole height of our window there. And then let's also text align everything to the center. And then the next thing I want to do is include our background image for our first project, which is this sort of library image here. So to do that, we'll grab the background property, URL, grab the image folder, head inside it and grab project 1. Now this is way too big at the moment, so the first thing I want to do is add a few more bits of styling. So we want no repeat. We want to center everything on the X and Y, and then we want this to cover the whole body. So as you can see now, it looks pretty much exactly the same as our original example. So that's it for the body there. Next thing I want to do now is grab the container class, which houses everything. I want to give this a width of 550 pixels, a height of 450 pixels. Now the next thing I want to do is just style our heading, which is the JavaScript quote generator text there. So we'll grab the header class. Let's increase the font size of this to, let's say, about 1.2 rem. Let's give this a border of solid, say about 2 pixels, and make it a nice white color. Change the color of the text to white. Let's make that a bit clearer, so we'll change the background color to a bit of a darker grey. Let's also add a bit of padding there between the text and the border, so about 5 pixels. And let's make the width of this to be about, say, about 80%. Set the margin to let's say 20 pixels from top and bottom, and then auto on the left and right, so this is centered. Now let's actually make the edges of our border here a bit more rounder. So we'll use the border radius method property. Let's make it about 5 pixels. I just think that looks a little bit better. So that's it for our heading. Now let's grab the main content, which is basically just all of our content here. So the quote, the person who said the quote, and then the button itself. So this is a class of main content. So what I want to do is just make the width of this be 100%. The height, let's make it about 300 pixels. The padding, let's give this a background color of white. So there's our content. Let's also make the edges more rounded, so say border radius, so about 15 pixels. Let's also add a bit of padding here between the content and the edges, so we'll say about 50 pixels on the top and bottom, about 40 pixels on the left and right. Next thing I want to do is actually give this a box shadow, so it gives it more of like a 3D look. So say 0 on the X and Y, but let's put about 10 pixels blur, so the box shadow is all the way around, which I think looks a lot better there. Now let's style the text or the quote. So this is the main content and the text area. So let's just give this a font size of about, let's say 1.5 rem, see what that looks like. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Let's also add a bit of line height here for 1.5. Give it a bit of breathing room. And yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Now we want to style the person who says the quote. So we'll say main content dot person, and let's increase the size of the text. So we'll say font size, let's say about 1.6 rem. Yeah, looks pretty good. Change the color to red. Let's think the original is capitalized, so text decoration uppercase. So text transform uppercase. Now of course we want to add a bit of margin here, so let's say margin top, about 20 pixels. So I think that's starting to look a lot like the original, as you can see there. Now let's now style the button. So we'll grab the button area, which houses the button, and we'll grab the actual button itself. Let's change the background color to that dark gray. Let's change the color of the text so we can see it to white, and let's increase the font size of this to say 1.2 rem. Let's actually make that a bit bigger, 1.3, and then let's add a bit of padding, of course. So we'll say 10 pixels on the top and bottom, about 15 pixels on the left and right. Let's also add a bit of margin to the top of this to separate it from that text there. So margin top, let's say about 20 pixels, and then let's make it rounded on the edges, so border radius, let's say about 5 pixels. So the last thing I want to do here is that when we click on this, you can see in the original when we click on this it actually changes color, so we need to change its active state. So we'll just grab this And let's grab the active pseudo class, and we'll say the background color, let's make it a light blue. So that's pretty much it for the styling. All we need to do now is start applying some logic to this so we can generate new quotes when we click on this new quote button. So the first thing we're going to need to do is head into the index.html file and just go underneath all of this content here and just put a comment for scripts, because this is where we're going to be placing all of our scripts, and then we're just going to link to that script file, or our first script file, so we'll source it to, it's called project1.js. project-1.js. So we've linked it to our JavaScript file, so we'll head into that. The first thing we're going to need to do is just create some variables. So we're going to need a variable for our button here, as well as the quote and the person that said the quote. So we'll just put a comment here saying variables, and we'll say let btn equal document dot query selector, and then we'll select the button, which has an ID of new quote. So we've stored our button inside that variable there. We'll create another variable now for our quote itself. So we'll just call this quote. We'll set this to document dot query selector, and I believe this has a class of quote. Close that off. So now we've stored the span, which has the quote inside of it, inside that variable there. And then lastly, we're going to need one more for the person, and we'll say document dot query selector, and this has a class of person. So we've got our three variables there. Now the next thing we're going to need is an array for all of our quotes. So we'll call this array, let's call it quotes. Now I'm going to copy and paste all the quotes I used in the original example, which I just found on the internet. I'm not really sure if those individuals actually said those quotes. But if you guys want to use different quotes and people for your quote generator, feel free to do so. So I'm just going to paste those in there. So there's all our quotes there, which I think is a total of 10 quotes. So the next thing we're going to do here is now apply an event listener to our button here. So when we click on this button of new quote, it will generate a new quote for us. So one of these quotes by one of these individuals. So we'll go underneath the array and we'll say btn dot add event listener, and we're going to look out for a click event, and we're going to have a function. Now inside of our function here, we're first going to need to create a variable which houses a basic math equation, which is essentially just going to involve the built-in math object and a couple of its methods. So let's call this variable, let's call it let random. Now as I just mentioned, JavaScript has that built-in math object, and this object has several methods. Now the two that we're going to be using in this equation are math.floor and math.random. Now we'll go over the equation again, but I'm first just going to create it quickly because it's just a bit easier to explain. So the let random is going to equal math.floor, and then inside of this method here we're going to have math again dot random, and we're going to times this by our quotes array dot length, which is essentially just all the quotes in our array. So again, how this equation is working is that the math.random times the quotes.length will generate a number between 0 and the total of number of quotes inside of our quote array. Now because math.random doesn't actually generate a whole number, we need to wrap this equation in math.floor, or the floor method, which essentially just rounds a number downwards to the nearest integer. And what this will do now is allow us to access our properties inside of our array, which are the variables of quote and person. So that's essentially how this variable and this math equation is working here. Now this equation will randomize through our quotes array. However, we need to display the quote and person inside of our array to a string format. So to do that, we'll go underneath the variable here, and let's grab quote first, and we need to change the inner text. And then we're going to set this to equal the quotes array, square brackets, to turn it into a string format, and then we'll put in the random variable, and we'll say dot quote, and then we'll do the exact same thing, but we'll do it for person. So I'll just change this to person. And this now should randomize through our quotes array and display new quotes said by different people. So if we go to the button and we click on the button, it's generated us new quotes, and it's also given us different people who have said those quotes. And that is our first project completed. So a pretty cool project and pretty straightforward to create. Alright guys, so the next project in this course is the Beginner Plus project, which is a modal. Now a modal is essentially just a UI element that appears in the foreground of a website, and they're usually triggered by the user, allowing them to view more information or complete an action without having to navigate to another URL. In our case, it's just going to show more information. So we have our UI element here in the foreground, and then if I click on this, you can see another box animates downwards. The rest of the content darkens, so it puts a lot more focus in the box in the middle, and that's essentially what our modal is here. Now, of course, in this box, you'd likely have more information, but I just wanted to keep it simple for this example. Now, the key concepts we're going to need for this project, switched it up a little bit. We're going to be using the document.getElementById, of course, the addEventListener method, the e.target, and we're going to be using CSS styling throughout JavaScript, and we're also going to include some CSS animation in this project. So let's head into VS Code now and create our modal. Alright guys, so we're back inside our master DOM manipulation part 2 folder, and as you can see, we've got our blank canvas there open up in live server. So the first thing we're going to need for our markup is just going to be the modal open button. So we'll just put a comment in here, modal open button, which is the button, if we take a look at the original example, this button here, which is going to trigger our modal. So we're just going to have a button, this is going to have an ID of open BTN, because we're going to be using getElementById for this example, and we're just going to put a paragraph tag in here, and this is just going to have the text of where's our modal. So that's it for the open button. Now the next thing we're going to need is the actual modal itself, so we're just going to put a comment in here, say modal and modal background. So we're going to have a div with the ID of modal container. Inside of that, we're going to have our div with the ID of modal, which is going to be our modal. Paragraph tag inside of that, which is going to say here I am. And then underneath that, we're going to have another div, which is going to be our close button. So we're just going to have, let's say div, we'll give this an ID of close BTN. And to create that X, we're just going to be using a HTML entity. So it's going to be an ampersand times semicolon, and that's going to be that cross that you can see there. So that's all we're going to need for the markup. The next thing I want to do is just quickly comment out this script for project 1, but duplicate this and then link it to project 2. So if I actually open this up, you can see I've created another JS file, which is project 2. Just close that back up. So the next thing I want to do now is just apply some styling. So we'll head inside the style sheet, and the first thing I'm going to do is get that background image that you see here in the original example. So we're just going to grab the body, and we're going to change the background to URL, and this is going to be the image folder, project 2, and then apply those same rules that we did in the previous example. So no repeat, center, center, and then we're going to have cover, so we'll be able to see the image there. And then to make it the whole height of the browser, I'm just going to change the height to 100 viewport heights. So there's our image. Now the next thing I want to do is actually position this relative, because I want to initially position our button here a little bit further down and slightly to the right, just like it is in our example here. So what we're going to do is now grab that button, which has the ID of open button. I'm just going to open our modal, set the position of this to be absolute, so we can now position this anywhere on our browser there. I'm going to say top, say about 70%, and then let's also from the left about 10%. Now let's start giving this a bit of styling so it looks a little bit better. We'll give this a width of 350 pixels, make it a bit bigger, and we'll also give it a height, let's say about 80 pixels. Let's make the font size a bit bigger, so say about 2 rem, see what that looks like. Yeah, it looks pretty good. And let's make the background transparent, just like the original. Change the color of the text to white so we can see it. Let's also change the color of the border. Let's make it solid, 2 pixels, white. Now let's also let's add a bit of border radius to the edges, just because I think it looks a lot neater when the edges are rounded. So let's say about 10 pixels. And maybe a bit of padding, so say about 5 pixels there. That looks pretty good. Let's also use our good friend box shadow, give it that nice 3D effect. So we say 0 on the X and Y, but 3 pixels blur, so it goes all the way around. Let's make it black, the blur. Yeah, looks good. Now, if we take a look at the original, you can see there's an effect on there, so we need to add a transition. Transition, say about 5 seconds. So that's pretty much it for that styling. The next thing I want to do obviously is add a bit of a hover effect. So we'll just grab this. So we'll just grab this and paste it in here. Hover effect, or hover class, and we'll change the background color. We'll change the background color to white, and then the text to black. So there's that effect, which is the exact same as our original there. That looks pretty good. Now the next thing I want to do is style our modal here, which is going to be that box that shows up when we click on this button here. So as the class of modal, and then we'll change the background color of this to be white. We'll set the position of this to be absolute. Then we'll say, scroll down so you can see, we'll say top 50%, left 50%, and then transform, translate, and we'll say negative 50% and negative 50%, which would basically just center this in the middle. So this is just another way to actually center content instead of using Flexbox or CSS Grid. Now I want this to be a bit bigger, so we'll say width, so 200 pixels, height, let's say 100 pixels, give it a bit of padding on the top and bottom, and then 20 on the left and right. The old classic border radius, give it those rounded edges, and then the font size, let's make this a bit bigger. Let's say 1.5 rem. Now this is actually not going to display at the moment, but I just want to create the styling here so we don't have to do it afterwards. Now this modal is actually wrapped inside of the modal container, which we're going to be displaying as none initially because we don't actually want this to show, but I just wanted to start everything first before I make this sort of disappear initially. Now the next thing I want to do is, if we take a look at the original example, you can see that the text is on the left and the X is on the right. So to do that, we're going to be using display flex. So we have like a nested flex box, and then we'll just say justify content space between, and then we'll align the items vertically to the center. Now if we take a look again at the previous example, click off this, you can see this actually animates from the top. So we're going to be using keyframes to do this. So I'm going to create an animation, say animation name. We're going to call this animate modal, and then we want the animation duration, which is going to be 0.4 seconds. we'll create this animation right at the end, but I just wanted to again put all the styling on this modal first before we get to that. So the next thing I'm going to do is style the cross here. So this has a class of, not a class, sorry, an ID of close BTN, font size, let's make this about 3 rem, so it's nice and big. And then let's apply a hover to this, so when we hover over it, it turns red. So close BTN. Let's make it also a cursor pointer. Font size. Let's also make sure this is 3 rem. And then change the color to a red color. So let's say F000. So there's our cross there. Now just to quickly mention, guys, this is the same style sheet we were using in the previous project, so it has those general styles there, just in case that confused some people. But anyway, we've done the modal now, so what we need to do is actually grab the modal container and actually initially make this disappear. So we'll grab the modal container and we'll display this as none. Comment this out so we can still see it, but what I want to do is actually position this to fixed, so it's right at the top there, and we'll say top 0 and then left 0, width 100%, and then the height to also be 100%. And then have the Z index here. Let's have this at 1, so it's above everything. So let's just uncomment this now so we can no longer see it. So that's nearly it for the styling. There's still some styling in regards to the animation, which we can do in just a moment, but let's first start applying some JavaScript to this. So we'll head into the project2.js file, and the first thing we're going to need to do is just create some variables. So one for the open button, one for the modal container, and then one for the close button. So we'll just put in here comment for variables. We'll say let open btn equal document dot get element by ID, which we're going to be using for this example. And this has an ID of open btn. And then we'll create another one for the modal container. So we'll say modal container equals document dot get element by ID, and this has an ID of modal container. And then one more for the close button, so close btn equals document dot get element by ID, and this has an ID of close btn. So that's it for the variables. The next thing I want to do is now start writing out our event listeners. So we'll just put in here event listeners. So the first one we're going to apply it to is the open btn variable, so the open button. So we'll say open btn dot add event listener. Look out for a click event function, and inside of this function we're going to be using CSS styling. So we're going to grab the modal container and we're going to grab the style attribute, and then inside of the style we're going to be using the display property. Set this equal to block, because if we take a look at the style.css, you can see we have this as displayed as none. Now we wanted to display it as block when we click on the open button, which is this button here. So if I click on this now, it should show us our modal. As you can see, it's popping up in the center there. So this event listener is working. Now we can't actually click off of this modal, so we can't really close it. We're going to need a couple more event listeners. So we'll do one for the close button there. So we'll say close btn, add event listener, look out for a click event function, and inside of this function we'll apply the same sort of styling. So we'll say modal container dot style display attribute display property and then we'll set this to none, so we'll just revert back to none. So now we've got our two event listeners here. We've got our open button, and then for our close button there, if we click on this should get rid of our modal, and as you can see, that's working now. Now if we take a look at the actual original example, if we click on this and we show our modal, it closes if we click on the close button here, but if we also click outside anywhere of our modal here, you can see it closes the modal too. So I want to add another event listener so we can do that. So we actually apply this to the window object. So this is actually the highest object in the DOM tree. This goes above the document. So we'll say, look out for a click event. Function again. We'll insert the event object in there. And then inside of the function itself, we're going to use an if statement. So we're going to say if e.target. If you guys remember back to the part 1 of this course, the event.target essentially just returns the element that triggers the event, which in this case is going to be our window. So we're going to say if e.target is equal to modal container, we're going to grab the modal container, use the same style attribute, display property, and we're going to equal this to none. So again, what this should do now is when we click on this to activate our modal, so we can see it on the screen, we should be able to click anywhere outside of this modal and the modal will disappear. So as you can see, that's working. If I click up here, disappears, click up there, disappears, and if we also click on the close button, it will disappear. So that's pretty much it for the JavaScript. Pretty simple design really, and quite simple to create. The next thing I want to do is just apply some styling to the modal and the modal container, because if I click on this, you can see that the background darkens around the modal, as well as the modal smoothly animating from the top of the browser there. To do that, we'll head back inside our style.css, and to create that nice animation, you can see we've got animation name and the animation duration. We're going to be using keyframes, so we'll just say, put a comment here first, modal animation section. We'll say the @keyframes rule. Use the name, which is animate modal. Is that? Oh, it's not got a capital M. And what we want to say is just use the from and to. So from, I'm going to say top -300 pixels. Set the opacity to 0 so we can't see it. And then to, we'll say from the top 50%. And then the opacity to 1. So as you can see, when we're typing this keyframe out, the animation is working. So I'm just going to click off this, click on our open button, and you can see now the modal is animating exactly the same as the original. And lastly, I just want to create this this dark background when the modal appears. So to do that, we're going to go in the modal container here, or the ID of modal container, add a background color, RGBA, we'll say 0 for red, 0 for green, 0 for blue, and then for the alpha, which is the opacity, we'll say 0.2. And as you can see, it just gives the modal container, which is wrapping around the modal, a nice dark effect, which just gives us a good emphasis on the modal itself. So this now looks exactly like our original example. So it looks pretty good. So our third project is going to be an accordion. Now what an accordion does is let you squeeze in a lot of content into a small space in a web page. And a classic example is like one in our project here, which is an FAQ, or frequently asked question, which you'll most likely see utilised in many websites. So as you can see here, we have a couple of questions, just some random questions like a return policy or where they're located. And if I click on one of these, you'll see it open up and show us more content, which again is a really useful project to learn, as you're most likely going to be utilising this type of design in many of your own projects. Now the key concepts we're going to need in this tutorial are document.getElementByClassName this time, of course the add event listener, the for loop, the this keyword, and the class list and toggle method. So let's head into VS Code now and create our accordion. Alright guys, so the first thing we're going to need to do is create the markup for the accordion. So we're going to have a class of accordion, which basically just houses everything, or the accordion. Then I'm going to have a h2, the class of say accordion title, and we'll say frequently asked questions. And underneath that, we're going to have several containers, which is going to house the question and the answer. And you guys can put as many of these containers as you like, but I'm just going to use 3, which is the exact same as our draft example. So we're going to create that class of content container. And this is also going to be the class that we link to our JavaScript, so we can show that extra content. So inside of these, we're going to have class of question. So the question, first question is, what is the return policy? And then we're going to have the class of answer, which is just going to be some dummy text. And then we'll just duplicate this container 2 more times. Again, you guys can include more if you like, but we're just going to stay the same as the draft example. So that's essentially it for the markup. Let's head into the style sheet now and just apply some styling to this. Now the first thing we're going to do is just grab the body and include our background image. So this is going to have a URL, image folder, project 3, and then a few more bits of styling. So no repeat, center on the X and Y, and then cover so we can see the whole image. Make this the whole height of the browser, and then use Flexbox again to center our content, and then align items to the center. So that's all we need for the body. Let's start applying some styles to the accordion, which pretty much just houses everything. We're going to give this a width of 65%. Background color, let's give it a white background color. Add a bit of padding, so let's say about 30 pixels all the way around. And then of course our good friend border radius, just to make the edges more rounded, so we'll apply 30 pixels there. Now for the title itself, we'll go and give that a bit of styling. This has the accordion title styling. Scroll down so you guys can see it a bit clearer. We'll just add some margin bottom of 30 pixels to separate it from the rest of the content, and then text align to the center, so it's centered there. Now let's apply some styling to our questions there. So grab the accordion, content container, and then grab the question or class of question, and let's give this some padding too. So 18 pixels on the top and bottom, 0 pixels on the left and right, and let's also increase the font size a little bit to 22 pixels. Set the cursor to a pointer, and then let's add a border bottom here, 1 pixel solid black, so it has a line underneath the questions, just so it's a bit clearer to see the separation between that and the content. And then the next thing we need to do here is set a position of relative. That's because we're going to be positioning the open and close sections that you see here in the original example absolute to our question class. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do now. So we'll grab the accordion class, content container, question class, and we're going to be using the pseudo element of after, and we'll go inside this and we'll grab the content property and use a plus sign in there, and then we'll position this absolute, and then from the right we'll say about -5 pixels. So I think that looks pretty good there. Let's now focus on this content here, so the dummy text. So we'll go underneath this bit here, grab the accordion class, grab the content container, and then we'll grab the answer class, which is the dummy text, and we'll add a bit of padding top of 15 pixels, just so it separates it from the border bottom there. We'll increase the font size of this to about 22 pixels as well, and then let's add a bit of line height, let's say 1.5 between the content, and then make sure the width of this is 100%. Now, of course, we want this content to be hidden initially like it is in the original example. So to do that, what we're going to need to do is change the height of our answer class there to 0 pixels. Now, if you take a look at the browser, you can see that all of the content is overflowing. It's doing exactly what we want it to do by setting the height to 0 pixels. But of course, all this content here, we want it to be hidden. So what we can do to hide that is just use the overflow property and set that to hidden. And as you can see, all of that content isn't showing. Now, one last thing I want to do in here is that if we take a look at the original example, we open this up, you see it's nice and smooth. So to do that, we're going to need to set the transition of this to be about 0.5 seconds, so that when we do apply the JavaScript and we click on these, it'll be nice and smooth. So that's almost it for the styling. We're going to need a few more bits in just a moment, but first we need to create the JavaScript to get this all working. So we're heading to the JavaScript file there, and the first thing I'm going to do is just create a variable. I'm just going to put a comment in here, variable, and this variable is going to be called accordion, and we're going to be using the document.getElement by class name. So this is going to select all of the elements with this class name, and we want to select the content container classes, which houses the question and the answer. Now we're going to want to access all of these classes, and to do that we're going to need a for loop. So we're just going to put in for, we're going to have a variable of I equals 0, and then we're going to say I is less than the accordion dot length. And if it is less than the accordion.length, which it will be, we want to increment this I variable by 1. Then inside of this for loop, because we're essentially selecting all of the classes of content container, we want to apply an event listener on each of these. So we'll grab the accordion and then grab the variable of I inside of our for loop, and then add an event listener here in where we want a click event. So on each of the content containers we want a click event. Then we're going to include a function, and then inside of this function what we want to do is reference the object of which the function is a property, or in other words reference the object that is currently calling the function, which in this case is our accordion. And we can do that by using the this keyword, and then using this we can insert a class of active on all of those reference points, which are essentially our content containers. So we'll say class list dot toggle, which is just another method which I actually forgot to mention in part 1, but what this essentially does is just toggle between adding and removing a class name for an element with JavaScript. And the class that we want to toggle is of course the one I just mentioned, so we want to call this class active, which I'll show you guys in a minute why we need to do this. So what we've done here is store all our elements with a class of content container inside of this variable of accordion. We've then looped through this variable, and this has allowed us to add an event listener to all of our content container classes. And inside of the function we've then referenced this object that is calling the function, i.e. our accordion variable, and then added the toggle method to either add or remove the class of active. So all we need to do now is head back into our CSS and apply the styles to our active class we created inside of this function. So we'll head back to style.css again, and then what we'll do is just put a comment here and say JavaScript styling link. Go underneath here and then just grab the class of accordion, grab the content container class, select the active class we created inside of our JavaScript, and then grab the answer, or the class of answer, which is all of that content which has a dummy text inside of it, and then just set a height of this to be 150 pixels. So what this should do now is, using the JavaScript we just created, toggle the class of answer so that when we click on any of the questions, the height of the answer container will be 150 pixels instead of 0 pixels, and then show us all that content. So if I click on this, you can see now it's opening up and showing us all that content. So you can see that the JavaScript is working, as well as the styling we just created with the active class, we just inserted with the active class. So just a few little bits here now to finish off. So we'll just grab the accordion, grab the content container, grab the active class again, and we'll grab the question. So I just want to change some style into the question when this is clicked. So let's affect the font size so it's a little bit smaller. So we'll say about 18 pixels, and we want this to be smooth. So we'll just put a transition of 0.5 seconds. So as you can see, this shrinks down when we click on this, just so it puts more emphasis on the content there. And then lastly, let's change the open button to a closed section when we click on it, just like it does in the original example here, as you can see there. So let's go underneath this, grab the accordion class again, content container dot active, and dot question after pseudo element. Change the content to a dash. Let's also increase the font size of this to 30 pixels. And let's give it a nice transition, 0.5 seconds. And as you can see there, it's all working perfectly fine. The JavaScript's all working, as well as the styling. So that's going to be it for this project. Another really useful project to learn, as you'll most likely run into needing something of this project's nature. So for our fourth project, we're going to be upping the ante a little bit and creating this pretty cool stopwatch, which, as you can see here, we have a play and also a reset button. If I hit the play button, you'll see it transform to a pause button as the stopwatch is starting. If I pause it, it will pause on that number, and then I can also reset this if I want to. So a pretty cool design, and we're going to be implementing much more JavaScript for this project. Some of the key concepts we're going to need for this project are document.querySelector, document.getElementById, add event listener, if statements, the toString method, the setInterval method, and inner HTML. So now we know the project and the key concept we're going to need for the project. Let's head into VS Code now and create our stopwatch. Alright guys, so we're inside our index.html file. And the first thing we'll do is just create a div with the class of container. Inside of that div, we're going to house another div, which is going to have an ID of timer. And inside of this, we're just going to display our timer. Then underneath that, we're going to have our buttons. So we're going to have a div with the class of buttons. And then we'll have the stop button. And this is going to have, initially when we're first showing this, going to have an icon. And this is going to have a class of fa-solid, fa-play. And we're also going to give this an ID of play. And then we'll just duplicate this for the reset button. Reset btn. And this is going to have an ID of reset. And instead of play, it's going to have arrow dash rotate dash left. So that's all we're going to need for our markup. Let's head into style.css and just apply some styling here. So first thing we're going to have is the body, and we're going to include our background image just like in the previous examples. But first let's just make the height 100 viewport heights, background, URL, img, project 4, and of course some of that classic styling, so no repeat, center, cover, so we can see the whole image. So there's our guy there, and then we want to position everything in the center, so let's display this as flex, justify content, center, align items to the center. Now let's grab the container which houses everything, and this is going to have a width of 60%, a height of 250 pixels, background color is going to be white. Let's give it that nice border radius, 30 pixels, and then let's just give this a bit of shadow, so 0 on the X and Y, and then 3 pixels blur, so it's all the way around. Now the next thing I want to do is style the timer here, so this is an ID of timer. Set the width of this to be 100%, font size, let's make it 72 pixels, so nice and big. Text align this to the center, give it a bit of margin, so 0 on the top and bottom, auto on the left and right, and then let's also give this a bit of padding top. Let's say about 35 pixels, just to push it down a little bit. Now as for the buttons themselves, we'll grab the button, we'll grab the buttons class, which houses the buttons. We'll text align this to the center, and then let's give it a bit of margin on the top. Let's say about 40 pixels. And then let's style the buttons here. So let's give a bit of margin between them so they're not like squished up next to each other. So we say 0 on the top and bottom, about 10 pixels on the left and right. Give them that space. Let's also remove the border, both of them, and then let's style the actual icons. So button I, say font size, let's say about 2 rem. Padding, so about 10 pixels, and then let's change the color to white. Now we can't actually see those really clearly, so let's grab the IDs of each of those. So we've got one for play, duplicate that, one for pause, which we'll create later, and one for reset. Now for play, this is just going to have a background color of green. For reset, this is going to have that background color of red. And then for pause, it's going to have a background color of orange. And that gives them their background color. Now the buttons here actually aren't the same size, so let's just quickly make these the same size. So we'll say about 50 pixels. Yeah, that looks a lot better. So that's pretty much it for the styling. Let's head into the project4js file now and start adding some functionality to our stopwatch here. Alright guys, so the first thing we're going to need to do is just create some variables for our buttons. So I'm just going to put here variables for buttons, and we're going to say const start stop btn equals document dot query selector, and then we're just going to select the ID of start stop btn, and then we're going to have one more for our reset. So reset btn equals document dot query selector, and this has the ID of reset btn. So there's the variables for our buttons. The next thing I want to do now is just define a few variables to hold time values. So put a comment here again, time values. So we'll say let seconds equal 0, let minutes also equal 0, and then let hours equal 0. So that's all the variables we're going to need at the moment. The next thing I want to do is actually create our stopwatch function, which is going to determine when our stopwatch needs to increment to the next number, i.e. seconds, minutes or hours, as well as displaying that value in the UI. So we'll just put in here stopwatch function, and then we'll just say function. We'll call this stopwatch. So firstly, what we want to do when we invoke this function is actually increment the seconds. So when this fires off, when we press the play button, the seconds will start to increment. So we'll just say seconds plus plus. Now of course, if we leave it like this, it's just going to increment the seconds. It's not going to jump to the next value. So if we want it to increment when it gets to the minutes and the hours, what we're going to need to do is just create an if statement, and then we're going to say seconds divided by 60, which is the amount of seconds, is equal to 1. We then want seconds to jump to 0, and then we want the minutes to increment. So what we're saying here is that once this reaches 60, our seconds will restart, and then the minutes will start incrementing. So that's how we increment the next value. Now of course we haven't just got minutes, we've also got hours, so we need to include that as well. So we'll apply the same logic here. So minutes divided by 60 is equal to 1. The condition we want is that minutes reverts back to 0, and then the hours increment. Now what we need to do from here is actually create a variable to display this if statement in the browser, so our stopwatch will actually increment, otherwise the numbers will just stay static the way they are now. So to do that, we're just going to need to go underneath this if statement here and say, let's say let display timer equal document dot get element by ID. We're going to get the ID of timer, and we're going to change the inner text. Just scroll down a bit so you guys can see that. And we're going to set this to equal hours plus colon plus minutes plus a colon again, and then finally seconds. Close that off. So what we're doing with this variable is just making sure that when our if statements here are working, we want it to be displayed in the browser. So the way we can display that and check that out is we'll just grab the window object, and then we're going to grab the set interval function, which is basically just a method that calls a function at a specified interval. And the function, of course, that we want is going to be our stopwatch. And this set interval takes in two parameters. So first the function and then the amount of time. And we're going to be putting 1000, which is 1000 milliseconds. So we'll say stopwatch and then time of 1000. And if we take a look at the browser now, you can see that it's beginning to increment. And then if we just make this a bit quicker, so we'll lower it down to 1, you can see that the minutes now is also incrementing. And then if we just wait a little bit longer, it should jump to the hours. And as you can see, the hours now is also incrementing when it gets to that 60. So I'm just going to put this back to 1000 and then comment it out. Now, of course, as you've just seen there, when this function fires off, the leading 0 disappears. And if you take a look at our demo example here and we play this, you can see that it starts incrementing as it should, but the leading 0 is still there. Now to fix this, what we're going to need to do is actually create a couple more variables. So we'll go underneath these variables here and then create variables for that leading 0. So say variables for leading 0. So we'll say let leading seconds equal 0. Duplicate this a few more times. Let leading minutes equal 0. And then obviously hours. Now what we need to do is go back inside our stopwatch function here, go underneath this if statement here, and then create some conditionals to include that leading 0 if our seconds, minutes and hours is only one digit. So we'll say if seconds is less than 10, we want to grab the leading seconds and then set this to that leading 0, which is a string value, but we also want to make this a string value. So we'll say toString, but we also want to make this a string value, so we'll apply the toString method, which will turn this all into a string. Else we'll just make sure that else we'll just leave the leading seconds to equal the normal seconds variable. So of course we want to create two more for minutes and hours. So we'll say this one is for minutes and leading minutes, hours, leading hours. And of course we're also going to have to change the variable here too. So we'll say leading hours, leading minutes, and leading seconds. So again, what we're doing here with the if statements is making sure that our leading 0 will show if our stopwatch is only showing one digit. And as we just seen, when we invoke the function here with a set interval, that leading 0 will disappear. But because of the statements we just created here and this variable which will display it in our browser, if I uncomment our set interval here, it should start incrementing with that leading 0. So I'll uncomment this out. And as you can see now, it's incrementing with that leading 0. And if I just speed it up, it should also apply to the seconds, minutes and hours. As you can see, it's working in the minutes, and then if we just wait a little bit longer again for the hours, the leading 0 should still stay there, and as you can see, it's working exactly the way it should. So I'll just put this back to 1000 and just comment that out. Now we're actually invoking this stopwatch when the browser loads because we're immediately invoking it through the window object and our setInterval function. But of course, we want to have more power than this, and what we want to do is actually add functionality to our buttons. So what we're going to need to do now is actually create a few variables to hold the setInterval function, as well as containing the status of our stopwatch, which I'll show you guys exactly what I mean. So let's create those two variables. We'll actually create them up here. So variables for setInterval and timer status. So we'll say let timer interval equal null, just for the time being, because we want to choose when we want the stopwatch to run, not when the page loads. And then of course create another variable for our timer status, and we're going to set this equal to a string value of stop. We now need to use these variables and apply it to our start stop button variable there. So we'll just go underneath here, and then we'll grab that start stop button, add the event listener. We're going to look out for a click event. We'll grab the function. Inside of this function is going to be where we use those variables we just created. So we're going to say if timer status is equal to stopped, we then want to grab that timer interval variable and set it to our actual setInterval function there. Paste that in there, close that off. We then actually want to change our button to switch from a play button to that pause button like it does in the demo example. So we'll say document.getElement by ID, grab the start stop ID there, and then grab inner HTML, set that to backticks, and then we're going to grab the icon. This has got a class of fa-solid fa-pause, and then we want to actually include the ID, which gives it that color of orange, and this has the ID of pause. And then we'll close this off, and then we also want to change the value of our status. So we're going to grab the timer status and set this equal to started. Else, if the stopwatch is now running, we also want that functionality of where we can pause the timer. So to do that, we need to grab the window object again, grab the clear interval function, and what this will do is actually stop our timer, and then insert our timer interval variable, which is in reference to our timer variable there. Close that off, and then of course when this statement rings true, we also want to change our pause button back to our play button. So we're going to say document.getElement by ID, grab that start stop btn ID again, and then change the inner HTML. This is going to equal another icon, so i.class equals fa-solid fa-play, and then we also want to grab the ID of play so it has that green background color. Close this off, and then again obviously change the timer status back to stopped. So what we've done here inside of this function, we're just checking if the timer status is equal to stopped, the timer will start, and the play button will also change to a pause button, as well as the timer status changing to started. Else, we click the pause button, the timer will stop with our clear interval function there, and the pause button will revert back to a play button, as well as the timer status will change back to stopped. And this now should complete the functionality for playing and stopping our timer. So if we go ahead and test this, you can see it's changing to a pause button and our timer is starting to increment. If I press the pause button again, it will stop the timer and our button will revert back to the play button. So as you can see, our function is working perfectly fine there. Now we're almost done. We just need to add an event listener to our reset button here. So we'll go underneath this event listener here, grab the reset button variable, add an event listener, look out for a click event, grab the function keyword inside of this function, scroll down a bit so you guys can see. We want to grab the window object again, clear the interval so it stops, and then reference that timer interval. And then what we want when we click on this is grab the seconds. This is going to equal 0. Duplicate this 2 more times. Do the same for the minutes. and then same for the hours. And then again, we want this to actually display in the browser. So we'll say document dot get element by ID. We want to grab the timer and then grab inner HTML and then set this to the base of 0, 0 for the hours, minutes, and then for the seconds. So with this event listener we just created here for our reset button, inside of the function, we're again stopping our timer interval using the clear interval method, which is essentially just a method which clears the timer set out with a set interval method. Now this, of course, is referencing this set interval here. So again, this will stop our stopwatch just like it does in the else statement that we've done here. Now, of course, we don't just want to stop the timer, we actually want to reset it. So we revert all of our seconds, minutes, and hours back to 0, which we've done here just by changing the values back to 0. And then, of course, we want this actually outputted into the browser. So we use the document.getElementById, grab the timer, and change the inner HTML to 0 on the minutes, hours, and seconds. So this now should actually reset our stopwatch to 0. So if we go ahead and test this out, press the play button so it starts incrementing, and it also reverts to a pause. We'll pause this, reverts back to a play button, and our timer stops. And then now if I click this reset button, it should reset our timer. And as you can see, our stopwatch is working with full functionality, and this now concludes our 4th project. So quite a bit more JavaScript to take in for this project. However, once it's understood, it's actually quite a fun exercise to create. Alright guys, so for our master level project, we're going to be creating a to-do list. And how this to-do list works is that we simply enter a task inside the input tab here, and then we enter that task with our add button. And what this will do is add that task underneath our tab here, and when that happens we get some extra functionality. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. So let's just enter a task here. Let's say collect shopping. We'll enter that task, and as you can see, that task gets added underneath. And as well as that, we've got some extra functionality. So we've got this orange box here, and we've also got this trash can. Now what this orange box does is that if we complete the task and we click on this, it'll put a line through it. And if we want to get rid of the task completely, we'll just click the trash can. As you can see, it will delete that from the actual task list. Now, of course, this isn't the prettiest to-do list, but again, this isn't really the objective of this project, so feel free to style it however you like when you guys are creating yours. Now, this project is actually going to include quite a lot of what we learned in part 1, so I hope you guys are paying attention. So for our master level project, project 5, the to-do list, these are the key concepts we're going to need for the project. So we're going to be using document.getElementById. Of course, again, we're going to be using the event listener, e.target. We're going to be using the append child method, the create element method, the parent element method, as well as the remove and the classlist.add method. So quite a lot of the concepts we learned in part 1. So let's head into VS Code now and create our to-do list. So the first thing we need to do is create our markup for our to-do list. So we're going to wrap this in a div with the class of container, and then we're going to have a div which houses the input and the button. So we're going to call this, or we're going to give this an ID of add the task container. Inside of that, we're going to have our input, which should be the type of text. We're going to give it a placeholder value of enter task, which is just going to be that text inside of the input. And then we're going to give this an ID of input task, because we're going to need to grab onto this to give it an event listener in the JavaScript. And then we'll go underneath this and create our button. This button is going to have an ID of add task, because we're going to need to grab onto this as well. We're going to have an icon with a class of fa solid.fa plus, and there's our input and our button there. And then we'll go outside of this container, and we're going to have an ID which is going to be a container for all of the tasks when we do add them to our to-do list. So we're just going to give this an ID of task container, and that's all we're going to need for the markup. Let's head into the style sheet now and give this some styling. So the first thing we're going to want to do, in here is just grab the body, give this a height of 100 viewport heights, and then give it that background image, which is going to be an image folder, and it's for project 5. Then some extra styling here, just the same as the others. Now we want to align all of the content in the middle, so we're using Flexbox. Items to the center, so that will center our content. Let's now give some styling to the add task container. So it's got the ID of add task container. This is going to have a width of say 350 pixels, some padding, say 20 pixels on the top and bottom, and 10 pixels on the left and right, and give it some background color of white. and then our trusty friend border radius, just to give it those rounded edges, and then give it some box shadow, because always looks good with a bit of box shadow. And then we're going to also need to display this as flex, because we want to apply some flex rules to the input and the button there. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go and grab the input, give this a flex of 5 so it takes up most of the space. Give it some margin to the right so it's a bit of space between that and the button, so we'll say about 10 pixels. Give it the border radius for those rounded edges, and then font size, let's make this a bit bigger, so say 1.2 rem, and then let's also give it some padding, say about 5 pixels, see what that looks like. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And then for the button itself, this has the ID of add task. Say font size for this, because it's an icon, we increase the size with the font size property, say 1.1 rem, maybe 1.2, yeah, that looks good. And then let's also give this some padding all the way around. And oh, forgot to actually apply the flex properties, so let's give this a flex of 1, just so it occupies a bit of its own space. Let's give it a background color of white and the color of the icon green, and then the border, let's make it green, solid 2 pixels, classic border radius. So that's looking pretty good, and I think in the demo this has a hover effect, so let's actually apply a transition to this to 0.3 seconds, grab this and then apply the hover, and let's change the background color to green and the color of the icon to white. So let's go ahead and see if that's working. As you can see, it's got that nice hover effect now, so we know that we're going to need to click on this to add a task. Now, we're not completely done with the styling, as you'll see in a moment when we enter a task, but let's first add that functionality of adding a task to our to-do list. So let's go into the JavaScript file, and then we can style the entered tasks after this. So let's head into our project5.js file. So first things first, in the JavaScript we're going to need to create some variables, one for the actual button here, one for the input, and then one for the task container, which is going to hold all the tasks. So we'll do the first one. Let's put a comment here first. Variables, and we'll say add task equals document dot get element by ID. So the add task button has the ID of add task, and then one for the task container. We'll call this variable task container. It's going to equal document dot get element by ID of task container, and then we're going to have one for the input task equals document dot get element by ID, and this is going to again be for our input, which has the ID of input task. So we've got our variables. The next thing we want to do is create an event listener for our add button here, which is pretty much going to hold all of the power. So we'll say event listener for add button. So we'll say add task, which is that variable there, add event listener. We're going to look out for a click event, and it's going to say function, and inside of this function the first thing we're going to want to do is create a div, and we're going to store it inside a variable of task. So we'll say let task equals document dot create element, and we're going to be creating a div, and this div is essentially just going to house our task as well as that extra functionality of the check button and the delete button. So we're also going to want to give this task a class so we can style it. This is going to have class of task. So we've got our div there. Now we're going to need to insert a list item for the actual task itself, as well as that, again, that functionality of the check button and the delete button. So first we'll do the list item. It's going to equals document dot create element. We're going to create an li. Then we're going to want to, and then for this list item, we're going to want to display that text that we insert in the input or the value. So to do that, we're going to grab the li variable, and then we're going to say inner text is going to equal, and we'll do backticks here, and then we'll insert that variable of input task dot the value. Again, it's just what the value is that we're going to be inserting, so whatever task we insert inside of our input. And then of course we're going to want to append this inside of that div, which is the variable of task. So we'll append the li. So now we've got our list item. The next thing we want to include now is the check button and the delete button, so we can include some extra functionality when we do insert a task. So we'll say let's create a variable called check button. This is going to equal document dot create element, and we'll create our button, and then we'll say let's include the icon in here. So we'll say check button dot inner HTML is equal to say class of FA solid, to insert the quote marks there. So FA solid FA dash check, and then we'll just close that off. And then we obviously need to style this, so we're going to need to include a class, add check task, and we'll say task dot append child, and then we're obviously going to need to include this inside of our div. So we'll just say task dot append child, and then we'll append the check button, and then we'll duplicate this for our delete button. Change all of these to delete button, and then this one has trash dash can, and then let's also change the class to delete task. So we've created all the elements we're going to need to include in our task. The next thing we need to do now is just make sure this actually shows and appears in our browser when we try and add a task. So we'll say if, and actually I first just want to show you that we have a bit of validation here. So if we take a look at the demo example, if we try and enter a task without actually entering anything in the input, you can see we get this alert box which says please enter task. So for this button to work, we need to either add a task, or it's going to show us this alert box to tell us to enter a task, just so it's like a bit of validation to the project. So to do that, we'll say if input task dot the value, so whatever value we put inside of our input, is equal to nothing, then we'll include that alert box, please enter a task. So we'll just see if that's working. As you can see, that alert box is working. So we'll say else, we'll then grab the task container, which is going to be the container that houses all the task. Then we're going to append child, and we're going to append that task which houses the check button, the list item, and the delete button. So we'll just close that off, and we'll see now if this works. So we'll enter a task, we'll say collect shopping, hit enter, and as you can see there, it's included our list item, and it's also included our two buttons that we created. Obviously we're going to be styling this in just a moment, but one other thing I want to do just before we go into the style sheet and style this is that I want this to revert back to the placeholder text instead of holding the value we put in the input. So to do that, just grab the input task variable and the value. We want this to equal nothing. So if we go ahead and type that out again, collect shopping, enter that, you see it adds the list item, but it also removes it from the input, so we can insert another task. So we're almost nearly done here inside of the JavaScript. We'll come back and add the functionality to the checkbox and the delete button, but first let's just style all of this so it just looks a lot nicer and easier to work with. So we'll head back into the style sheet. So let's apply the styling now for our tasks when they get added to the list. So we'll just put a comment here saying styling for tasks which get added to list. So first we'll grab the tasks, which is the div which is going to house all of that content. So we're going to just give this a width of 100%, and then we're going to give this background color of white so we can actually see the content. Let's also give this some border radius, about 10 pixels, and then also a bit of box shadow. Always love a bit of box shadow. And then let's add a bit of padding here now, say about 5 pixels, and let's push this down a bit actually from our enter tab there. So let's give this some margin, bottom of 20 pixels, so just to separate the two. And then let's also give this a bit of margin bottom as well, so it separates all of the content, all of the tasks a little bit, so just say 5 pixels. And then let's grab display flex, and let's say justify content space between, and then let's now grab the list items itself, so dot task li, remove the list style bullet point. Let's give this a flex of 4, so it takes up most of the space. Let's give it a bit of padding, about 5 pixels, and let's increase the font size of these to say let's say 1.2 rem, maybe a bit bigger, 1.3. Yeah, looks good. And then let's give this a bit of margin as well, about 10 pixels. Now as for the buttons themselves, grab the task, we'll grab the buttons, and we'll give these a flex of 1. And let's also give these rounded edges, so border radius 10 pixels, and then the background color of these to be let's make them white. Now let's grab the items themselves. Actually, let's change the cursor to a pointer as well. So let's grab the task dot check task. It's going to have a color of orange, and let's give them a bit of space, so margin right about 5 pixels, and the border, say solid 2 pixels orange, and let's increase the font size of the tick there to, let's say, 1.5 rem. It's looking good. And then let's do a similar thing for the delete task, but instead of color orange, I have the color of red. I don't have any margin on this, but we'll change this to red. And let's decrease the font size of this to say 1.3. Yeah, it looks better. Now both of these have a hover effect, so let's do the check first. Say background color, change that to orange, and then the color to white. Copy this, do it for the delete task, and the background color is going to be red, the color is going to be white. So we'll hover over these and you can see those are working. So all we need to do now is just go to the JavaScript and apply the functionality to this. So inside of our event listener here, we'll go underneath the input task value there, and then we'll say check button add event listener. We're going to look out for a click event function, and we're going to say the check button, and then because we need to go one element above, we need to traverse the DOM. So just like we learned in part 1, we're going to grab the parent element, I'm going to say .style .text decoration, and this is going to equal line through. So we'll check if that works. So let's enter a task. As you can see, it's putting a line through our content there. Now let's do one more for the delete button, and we'll add an event listener to this, and we'll look out for a click event, grab the function. We're going to need the event object, and we're going to say let target equals e.target, which if you remember back to part 1, this is referencing the actual element that's being clicked. And then we want to grab the target and then grab the parent element twice. So we need to traverse the DOM 2 times, and then we want to press remove. So with the target here, we're referencing the trash can or the bin or delete button. One level up is the list item, and then one level above that is the task. So that's how it will remove it. And then we'll just add this to, we'll just check if this is working, sorry. So we'll enter this task, collect shopping, and then if we click the check button, it will cross it out, indicating that it's been completed. And then if we want to delete it, we'll just press the delete button here. So we can add more than one value here. So collect shopping, add that, and we'll do another one for walk the dog, add that, and then we can cross this out, we can delete the collect shopping. As you can see, the to-do list is fully functional. So that's actually going to be it for this project, guys. Again, the styling wasn't really the prettiest for this project. Again, this wasn't really the point of the project. Of course, this was more about how we can manipulate the DOM. But this now also concludes the part 2 video of DOM manipulation. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and learned a lot throughout the 2-part course. Be sure to leave it a like and leave any questions in the comments below that you may have, and I'll see you guys in the next video.